Welcome to Full Press, a media criticism podcast from The Hub, where listeners and viewers can escape for a precious 40 minutes every 2 weeks. The echoing mainstream media chambers. As always, I'm joined by Tara Henley and Peter Menzies, and I myself am Harrison Lohman, managing editor of The Hub. How are you guys doing days away from E-Day?
Sleepless.
Uh, Sleepless in Calgary.
would,
It's very romantic. Go ahead, Tara. How are you feeling?
I would echo that. I think that you said it best a while back that this election has been at times exhausting, at times exhilarating, and I'm in the exhausting stage right now.
Let's start with, I don't often swear on this program. Roger doesn't let me, but I think he'd be okay with this one. The shit show that occurred last week during and following the English language leaders debate. There's so many different moments to this Shakespearean drama that spilled out into the media about the media that just showed, the battle that's taking place between, and we're all about labels apparently here, guys, mainstream journalists, alternative journalists, new media journalists. I'll just give you a little sort of sampling of things that happened. Mainstream media gets pissed because Rebel gets a bunch of questions in the French language leaders debate, about 23% of them. Then, CBC is frustrated about that, sort of name calling about Rebel there. During the English leaders debate, Ezra Levant, head of media, head of Rebel News, approaches the CBC tent in a confrontation there. Security is called. There's a big back and forth between Cian Bexty, formerly of Rebel Media, now with Juno News, and a guy named Stuart Benson from the Hill Times, raising his voice there. Then they cancel the English leaders scrum. CBC wants Ezra to leave. Anyway, the RCMP is apparently involved in all this. There's police tape. Anyway, all this to say, just start us off. What did you make when you saw all these different moments that played out following the debate and what it means for media in this country?
I just found this whole story so disheartening on so many different levels. I think chief of which is that we, the media, became the story when the real story was what was happening on the debate stage. And that's what Canadians care about. I really don't think they care about these politics between journalists. And I think anytime you have a press room kind of devolving into a shouting match, it's never a good thing. But I think overall, in terms of the main points being made here, I just would say that this is the result. This is what happens when you have too big a gap between what is happening around kitchen tables and what is happening in the media. We in the media made a pretty concerted effort to narrow the topics that were acceptable for debate. And it's totally predictable that other outlets would pick up those topics. They're of interest to Canadians. And I think Ezra Levant is a conflict entrepreneur, that he thrives off this stuff. I will also say that I think what happened in the mainstream press really looked a lot like an elite moral panic, and that is not a good look for us. And we have to find a way to make sense of all of this and to move forward in a calm, rational, unemotional way in which we're actually able to serve the public interest in Canada.
Peter, what did you think about the back and forth there and the war that broke out?
Yeah, I found it very disturbing because cynical as I can be, I did not know it was as bad as that. And what I'm referring to is the sense of entitlement that the Peter Stockland and my rewrite Substack called it the other day, the courtier class of journalists who follow around the ruling class and report on them. Shocked to be in the presence and share the company with these vulgar entities
Vagabonds
that they're suddenly presented with, and then be so poorly equipped to manage it, right? I mean, and thinking that they had to explain their presence to people when there wasn't really anything objectionable about the questions. They were just questions that, as Tara explained, were outside this increasingly narrow window that's used by the mainstream mainstream press. And so I thought our leading journalists, as they like to think of themselves, disgraced themselves by doing that, and I think they undermined further trust within the public. Some will be happy that they outed what Robert Fife called in one of the interviews, these right wing agitators and that sort of stuff. So that's fine, but I don't think you know they're not. It's not that big a deal, and you don't need to be losing your mind over it in such a panicked, childish manner. It was really, really, we need more adult supervision in newsrooms.
Let me just give
I
my
would
take,
also say,
sorry, go ahead, Tara.
I would also say, Harrison, that this is about activist journalism as well. And I think that you can take a stand against activist journalism on the left and the right. If we want more objective aiming journalism in this country, and it seems from everything I can tell that the public does want more of that, then we should be objecting to activist journalists on the left and the right. We can do that without getting hysterical about it.
Well, yeah, there's another dimension in which the press conference is called off because there's some sort of sit-in based on, Indigenous rights or environmental issues by certain journalists there. And you imagine how mainstream journalists would react to that. Just to play devil's advocate and to express, I don't know, some of their views that, I would agree with. We can't deny that the Rebel are kind of professional, I'll swear once more, shit disturbers who play fast and loose with the facts. Ezra's appeared on InfoWars. They launched some pretty vile insults towards Rosemary Barton. They're a registered third party during the election. At the same time, you serve them up on a silver platter, people, everyone in mainstream media, exactly what they wanted. They exist off of this narrative. Mainstream media is out to get us. They won't let us at the table. They want stunts and antics. This was a huge stunt and antic. They then get to put on their website yesterday, CBC lied, we got the receipts, and fundraise off this stuff. So if you don't, like what they're doing, you just fund it a lot more. As Peter said, a precious reaction from a lot of people in mainstream media reiterating this holier than thou tone that the three of us have constantly pointed out. They just can't seem to get rid of that. And this loss of prestige that they seem to be worried about, this weird focus into something we could talk about on credentialism. Like when, a few years ago, weren't we obsessed with not being credentialized as journalists? And now suddenly we feel like everyone's got to have a press badge around their necks. And just finally, the questions, like I would share your interest in them because, they talk about gender, Indigenous grave stuff, to which Adrian Arsenault says, what's with all this identity politics? This doesn't sound like Canada. Certainly the Rebel questions and the True North questions, they're torqued and they're biased, but the reason why they have millions of listeners is because it's scratching an itch that, these people can't have scratched from mainstream media. A lot of these issues, they're not willing to touch them. I guess I'd ask you guys, like, how do we get along with these folks? They're not going away. They're often coming forward with larger audiences than mainstream media outlets. I kind of see it as like, you have a next door neighbor who maybe their garbage falls on your lawn. You don't like them particularly, but they're not going to move away. They're here to stay. You don't like them, but you gotta, I don't know, deal with them. They might not be in the same track as you, but certainly you need to tolerate them. They're adjacent to you. Like, Peter, how do we get along? What should go along here?
Well, I mean, I think the mainstream, if you want to call it that, needs to understand that it's not as important as it used to be. And the other thing I found, and I agree, I mean, the best thing you can do with Rebel is to ignore it, because
so hard,
they're
though.
always looking for a fight, right? And if you were to accept them, they would be confused by it, and not do that. The biggest thing is that this is media. And media is supposed to depends upon freedom of speech. Those guys got credentialed because they went to court. They tried to keep them out. They went to court twice. The court said, you haven't proved these people aren't journalists. They can go. Now, and I don't even think, I mean, what's the government doing organizing debates with, appointed commissions and that sort of stuff? That the government shouldn't be involved in that. And as I wrote the other day, I mean, that what the this is if this is part of Trudeau's legacy, then that commission clearly couldn't organize a booze up in a brewery. You can manage who gets what questions. You can have a lottery to see who asks questions, and you can tell everybody there's a maximum of 2 questions per news outlet, or you decide on a hierarchy based on your circulation and that sort of stuff. There's lots of ways to manage it if you understand that freedom of speech requires you to tolerate things that you find intolerable.
Yes, yes.
And that you need to suck it up, buttercup, and understand that this is part of democracy, that you have to put up with people that you dislike, who say things you disagree with strongly, and carry on and distinguish yourself by being better than they were.
Apparently they lined up early, guys. That was the reason they got so many reporters to ask questions.
Well, yeah, hello. They lined up early.
Well,
right?
This is their prom.
Which is a lot different than to elbowing their way to the front. Like, it's not like they showed up like a bunch of brown shirts with clubs and beat their way to the front of the queue. They just lined up early.
So we just need to set our alarm clocks earlier.
Apparently, that must have broken some sort of protocol.
Tara, they, I say this is their prom because they don't really get to ask like the NDP and Liberal leaders questions otherwise, really, right? Because they're not willing to talk to them. So they prepare big time for this, and I'm sure they have a whole sort of strategy put in place. At the same time, like I mentioned, you guys, I speak to David Cochrane semi-regularly, and he's sort of beside himself over this, extremely frustrated. He texts me, there's a constant and relentless harassment campaign coming out of the CBC defund narrative, he says. And, when it comes to folks who take in the Rebel and some of these other outlets, it has led to moments where our family's security has been compromised. How should we handle that statement, Tara?
Well, I think I would need more information on that. If that's the case, that's very distressing. I do not want David Cochrane's family to be at risk here. This is just a professional role that people play in society. And if that's the case, I find that incredibly distressing.
Mm-hmm. Peter, what do you think?
There's no excuse for that. There's no excuse for people doing that sort of thing, but it happens. And it happens often. There's stories of, female on-air journalists in particular getting stalked. When I, back in the day, was in a newsroom, we constantly had some characters that we were, getting restraining orders against. This isn't new, this sort of harassment of journalists. But that doesn't. I'm not trying to downplay it and make it sound as if it's acceptable, because it isn't. But it is something that has to be dealt with, and it is something that the employer needs to reassure. I mean, I've had incidents in my life when I had to move my family out to a hotel, so I'm sympathetic with that, and it's also, I think people have to be careful. Everybody needs to work to de-escalate when things start escalating. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying Cochrane is to blame there, but it's important to cool the rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. This is the thing. You could like everything here. It's something we try to do this podcast. The nuance gets lost. You can believe at the same time that mainstream media are acting sort of precious and, like I said, holier than thou in their tone, but then also call out Ezra for going after Rosemary and challenging her to a weight loss competition. Like, come on, guys, we're adults here. We're supposed to be professionals. Like, this is just gross.
Awful.
It is beneath all of us as an industry to be doing this high school stuff. And Coyne and Ezra fighting about hair dye and who he dates. Like, this is just, we're really in the thick of something here. And it comes all at the expense of the Canadian electorate and readers and listeners. But we're so happy. And maybe we can get into this, Tara, like, to affirm our biases and to have the tribes continue to exist within the Canadian and North American and Western media realms. Like, can you give us a sense of, you recently were talking to us about a piece that touches on these issues, like how all this crap just feeds more division in the populace?
Yeah. So I'm talking about a piece called Complicating the Narratives. It's a solutions journalist piece. It is from Amanda Ripley, who is a columnist at the Washington Post and also wrote a book called High Conflict. And basically about how we get trapped by high conflict. And she's really done a lot of reporting on polarization. And she's been on my podcast a few times. And she's interviewed journalists that have been in very polarized societies like Venezuela, for example. I also have a Venezuelan journalist coming up on my podcast talking about this. And the idea here is in high conflict, it becomes an us versus them conflict. It is very oversimplified. And so everything becomes black and white. It's very hard to see and understand people who have a different perspective than you have. And the point of it is it becomes very magnetic. It's very hard to get out once you get into these situations because the narratives become so cemented and the emotions are so high. And so there are actual ways that we as journalists can approach this. And there are tools that other journalists have used around the world. And a lot of it has to do with, as the title indicates, complicating things, becoming very curious, and really getting down to the specificity of stories, the actual granular information, and focusing on that. Also doing deep listening and exposure to the other side. So I think in this case, if you have the CBC on one side and Rebel on the other, I'm not saying this is going to happen or even to be productive at this point in time, but some sort of coffee listening session between the two sides, that kind of thing where you actually talk to people and ask them the personal reasons why they feel the way they do. I think if you sat down with CBC journalists and asked them why they were upset about this, they would have very interesting and personal reasons why this is important to them. And the same goes for Rebel. And so I think we have to start looking at, as Peter said, these de-escalation strategies, because ultimately it is the public that loses here. But also back to your point about Cochrane's family, I want us all to be safe, and I want us all to be able to go about our business without, ultimately threats. I think this is really important pivot moment for us in the media to really take a look at where we're at. And I think we can look at other journalists who've encountered this and draw some tools from them.
Peter, how do we de-escalate? And how do we encourage readers to read things they don't agree with? It's a very active action to read stuff you don't agree with, right? You can passively just get fed in the algorithms feed things to you that you agree with. So how the heck do we get out of this spiral?
This is fascinating. I've been thinking a lot about this lately because, to use my most common phrase now, back in the day, you used to have with newspapers when people were getting them regularly. I mean, the trick was you could have your lean, right? You could lean right if you were in Calgary. You could lean left if you're a little more liberal if you were in Edmonton. You needed to find your audience, right? But you also needed to make sure voices came from all segments of your society. So even if you leaned right, you would make sure that there were liberal left voices on those pages. So people would encounter alternative views by mistake without necessarily knowing in advance that this was going to be a liberal or a left of center view or a right of center view, and people would just read them on their merits. But now, I mean, the Toronto Star doesn't run any conservative commentary. The National Post doesn't run any liberal commentary. And if they're all going to get funded, maybe the government should make them do it. Which is,
you want more stipulations on the funding, Peter?
But why not, right?
At least one lefty or righty column.
If you're going to take the money, yes. What are you going to do? If you're, because this will happen at some point. It happened with the local journalism initiative. Initially, you had to be open to publishing rebuttals. That was the first set of rules, but that got dismissed fairly quickly because it was too hard to monitor in terms of that sort of stuff. But if you're going to take the public's money, like if the Toronto Star is going to get part of my paycheck, right? I want to have something that reflects my view of the world on the Toronto Star's pages. If the National Post is going to get part of I don't know, pick one. My point of view, if I'm a liberal, um, then why don't I get to have a say on their pages? So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to realize that people are seeking for places where they can go and get a variety of viewpoints on things, and that you might actually spend a little less time lobbying the government for more money and a little more time listening to your readers and serving them the way they want to be served.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If the subsidies are here to stay, which I can move into our next topic, Peter says might as well attach some stipulations that will make the electorate less insane, maybe. So let's get into that. I'll call this block a final anti-subsidy salvo. We learned this week that both the Liberals and the Conservatives seem to be prepared to extend media subsidies for private outlets in Canada. I remind readers and listeners, I guess just listeners and watchers, that these were subsidies that were supposed to be temporary. They were pitched as temporary. Many years later, they're still going. For me, I just want, before you even agree or disagree with them, Canadians should be aware of the various raft of subsidies that are being offered to various outlets. The federal government will spend some $325 million in 2024-2025 between the Canadian Media Fund, the Canadian Periodical Fund, the Canadian Journalism Labour Tax Credit, the Local Journalism Initiative, which the Conservatives just said they would boost by $25 million. What was your reaction, Tara, to seeing, I guess, both of the major parties sort of commit to this, and I guess the tracks being laid for what is a subsidy future for Canadian journalism while still funding the CBC and allowing them to make money off ads?
I'm a little bit speechless, honestly. I really don't know what this means for the future of independent journalism in Canada. I tend to be a pretty optimistic person, but I feel like this news is really bad news for us. And just to reiterate points that I've made in the past, I mean, there is indications this really impacts public trust, which is a crisis for us in the media in this country right now. There's also the fact that there's been work done looking at coverage of these subsidies, and it does indicate that there is some influence that these subsidies do have on editorial coverage. And then just the last point being that we really need innovation in the independent press right now. The three of us are all living and breathing that right now. And it's very difficult to compete when you are competing with heavily subsidized organizations. And so I think we're going to see some real dropping off of independent outlets if this continues. And I think that's really sad, both for viewpoint diversity, but also through for digital innovation and for finding new business models for media, which we desperately need in this century. So it's a lot of bad news as far as I'm concerned.
Peter, is that it? Is it table stakes now to take the subsidies? We, along with a handful of outlets, don't take them. You add the numbers together. We had David Snow, who's been on Tara's podcast, a very smart University of Guelph professor, add together the numbers. He says between the various media support programs and CBC funding, the federal government is spending over $1.7 billion annually subsidizing journalism and media. It's more than they spend annually on the Canada Disability Benefit. It's more than it plans to spend over the first 5 years of the National Pharmacare Plan combined. Is it table stakes? And what do you make of those large numbers I just launched your way?
Well, it's going to get worse. It's going to from now on, the subsidies will just get bigger because each election, it'll be in somebody's platform. Oh, I'm going to give you $100 million, or no, hey, I'll give you 125, or I'll give you 150. And as soon as the CBC gets another 150, News Media Canada is going to be back at the government's door. And the Liberals are very susceptible to lobbying because they've pretty much done everything News Media Canada has asked of them the last 2 or 3 years. So the subsidies will grow. And the bigger the CBC gets, the more subsidies these other guys will need. And that will make it eventually impossible for people like the Hub and Western Standard and some others to survive without taking the subsidies. Basically, you'll be forced in because you won't be able to I mean, anytime your competition is so heavily subsidized, unless you can find a magic formula, and unless unless your subscriber base can be, you can distinguish yourself as the last of your race, free and independent and trusted media, um, everybody will be forced into the pool, and the rules will get stricter as they go along. That's just the way these things evolve. Pretty soon the government will say, yeah, well, to qualify, we need you to make sure you have 10% of the space for BIPOC writers, another 10% or 5% of the space for LGBTQ writers. Just look at the list of things that Heritage Canada, the Canada Media Fund, the CRTC licenses. That's what you'll start to see, not just a subsidized, but a regulated press. So I know this, I can be accused of hyperbole, and it can kind of be my thing from time to time, but it is not hyperbolic to say that today, this is the end of a free, independent, and an era, the end of an era of a free, independent, and trusted media in Canada. And the real danger with that is people's loss of faith in it, and they will turn, guess where?
To the rebel folks we were just talking about?
That's
fill in the blank.
Where do you think they'll go? Or someplace new, or they'll turn to, Press Progress on the left, or they'll turn to, someplace else. But there, we talk about this narrowing window of questioning and lack of curiosity within it. You chase people out of there, right? And they go to places, and it's kind of like Pinocchio going to the islands, right? And you run into all kinds of bad characters, and the next thing you know, you're smoking cigars, and you're in all kinds of trouble.
Peter, you mentioned post-media. Let me come back at you here and just try to embody them. We have them up on the screen over here. So let me try and come back with what they would say. They would say, first of all, you're being hyperbolic, but also, okay, loss of a more independent press. But is that not better than the loss of these newspapers up here entirely? The loss of various local outlets? Like, what's your response to that? That that this would be an extinction level event if the government weaned outlets off these subsidies entirely?
The level of hubris involved in that argument is almost unimaginable. It's sort of, and we've heard it as they campaigned for the funding. Sort of, if the Toronto Star dies, or if the National Post dies, the National Post, it's only 25 years or 26 years old, something like that, right? Democracy dies. That is complete and utter. I'm not allowed to swear, right? You know where I'm going with that. Because if you die, somebody will replace you, right? This is like basic circle of life stuff, right? Just because you die doesn't mean journalism dies. You are not journalism. Right? How dare they say that about themselves? Right? It's absolutely shocking that they could set themselves up and say the world will be a worse place if we go out of business.
It's called solipsism.
No, it won't. Right? You will get rid of this dead wood, and I mean, Post Media has zombie newspapers all over the country that are getting funded, right? That post minimal number of CP stories a month, generally small weeklies and that sort of stuff. And we're supposed to subsidize. If they die, this is going to be the end of the world. That's just nuts.
So okay,
it's just
Tara, I'll ask you this: like, a lot of conservatives or folks on the right, they want institutions that have been around and had storied pasts to stay around. My grandfather worked for the Star for 40 plus years. It's an institution. I guess I don't know if they can still say this, the largest circulation newspaper in Canada. But for that to die, like, should I take from what Peter's saying, that's creative destruction? Like, we can't be hanging on to these old institutions covered in cobwebs that are not innovated and propped up by subsidies. Like, how should I think about that in my mind these days?
Peter, you go ahead. You jump in.
Well, I was just going to say, there are lots of people, and I know people who are sitting around waiting for their local Post Media Daily to die so they can buy that title.
Yeah.
Right? You can buy that title. My great-grandfather drove the first train, my namesake drove the first train into Calgary. And on that train was the press that printed the first edition of the Calgary Herald. So we have a lot of history there, right? And you don't want to see that die. It doesn't have to die, but you buy the title out of bankruptcy, right? You get rid of the other stuff, and you start again. Sorry, Tara, go ahead.
Tara, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to that argument. I love the Toronto Star. I actually wrote a books column for the Toronto Star for years, for a couple of years, and I'm very sympathetic to that argument. And I think that the fact of the matter is that we in the media have to find a way to build up a subscription model, and we have to find a way to generate audience and to generate an audience that is prepared to pay. We have to make a product that people want to pay for. And none of us are exempt from that. None of us. And the problem with the subsidies is it's now an uneven playing field. And so it's very hard to do that hard work of building audience when it's much easier to get money from the government. And it's just not going to end well for us as a media in terms of public trust.
It would have been so much easier, guys, if we all followed, I think it was the Wall Street Journal around 2007, who put up a paywall as the internet became more of a thing, and then basically got readers to be accustomed to the idea that if you want good, solid reporting, you're going to have to pay for it. Everyone is now accustomed to just getting it for free. I'm sorry, we're actually out of time, so we're gonna have to touch on the misinformation CBC correction next time. I promise we will. As always, a great discussion. We're marking it here. Peter Menzies says the end of independent press today on the, what is it, Amal? Day 31 of the election campaign. That's it for the full press during the election, but we will be with you 2 weeks from now to break down what will no doubt be more craziness from the Canadian media. Okay, I'll see you again soon, friends. Be well.